I'd just like to start today by really sharing some stories of how we're connecting the work locally, statewide, and then also nationally. And I'm going to start with the story of Joe. Joe's a 72-year-old man who was moved to St. Louis in 2008, and we first met Joe in 2009. When I first met with Joe, he sat down to tell me how he came to St. Louis. He had lived in Houston, Texas with his lifelong partner of 22 years when Joe became ill. His partner was taking care of him. However, Joe's children decided it was time for Joe to come home and live with them. So they drove to Houston, packed up all of Joe's belongings, including Joe, and moved him to St. Louis against his will. Upon arrival in St. Louis, they immediately hospitalized Joe. And when they checked him into the hospital, they told the hospital staff to list Joe as John Doe for the sole purpose of keeping him isolated from his lifelong partner of 22 years. Now, when Joe told me this story, I sat there and just could not imagine what that experience must have been like for him. And then I started to wonder, how many other Joes do we have, not only in St. Louis, but across the United States? How many Joes have been separated from their lifelong partners, their communities of support, simply because their family members don't recognize, honor, or respect those relationships? And for us, as a new organization only a year old, we realized that this was why we were here. This is why St. Louis needed us. And we needed to be a voice, and we needed to help educate our older adults about what their rights were. So in 2010, we had the opportunity to apply for some funding through SAGE USA for their SAGE Advocacy grant. And we were one of 5 SAGE affiliates to be awarded this grant. Through this grant, we were able to take 3 older adults to New York City, where they joined with their peers from across the United States and went through a 3-day intensive training where they learned more about the rights of LGBT older adults, and they learned advocacy skills. And most importantly, they learned how to tell their story. They then brought these new skills back to St. Louis, and they reached out to their peers and they trained them. And with that, we took 10 older adults to our lobby day in 2010, which was hosted by Promo, our statewide equality group. And while we were there, Promo asked our SAGE advocates to join them for a meeting with our Attorney General. We sit down with the Attorney General, and our SAGE advocates begin to tell their story of what it's like to live in a state that doesn't have non-discrimination policies that are inclusive of the LGBT community. One of our SAGE people had been fired from her job as a CEO with a top financial firm in St. Louis. They continued to tell their stories, and as they finished, I summed up our experience with the Attorney General that day. And I told him, we understand how slow the political process can be and how messy this process can be. But for our LGBT older adults, they no longer have time to wait because their lives and so often their well-being are at risk, because in the state of Missouri, they can be fired, they can be denied housing, and they can be denied the basic services that their neighbors receive without fear of retaliation or discrimination. Our Attorney General immediately asked, "What can I do to help?" And then he answered his own question. And he said, "What if I develop a reporting system through my office so that any discrimination that takes place can be reported directly to my office?" So for the first time in the history of Missouri as a state, we have a state office that's taking our complaints and is taking our concerns seriously. And we're able to record this data that's going to help us move forward in our fight for equality in the state of Missouri. So I want to return back to Joe. We take this new knowledge back to Joe, and we start to sit with him and help him plan how he can avoid this scenario happening again. We told him about, his rights to visitation. while he's in the hospital because of President Obama's executive order. We tell him that he has the right to do legal planning to ensure that his partner is an active part of his life and his medical decisions, and that his children do not have the right to separate them. And so he met with a lawyer, and they got all the legal documentation in place. And then we told him about the Attorney General's office agreeing to take the discrimination plaints, should this happen again. And when you talk to Joe today, you see an increased sense of respect for himself and the self-esteem that he needs to truly stand up and advocate for his rights. So as I look at the integration between the local, state, and the national work, to me it really does start to show how, by bringing the forces together, we can help ensure that all the Joes across the United States one day can live their lives with a sense of peace and dignity and not have to be fearful of discrimination, abuse, and neglect.